Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so very much for being here. As you can see, I am not the Reverend Dr. Allan Bosek, but he is indeed on his way. He is with Krista, and I just wanted to let you know that he will be here shortly. In the meantime, he was here this morning at Lake Edge Lutheran Church, where he preached 2 dynamic services, and it was certainly good to have him there. We are glad to have him here, and he will be in really at any moment. There was a little transportation snafu. But let me do this while we're waiting, so that when he comes, we won't have to do it. You may or may not know that I met Dr. Boesak in January as part of my Doctor of Ministry studies. He was the lead professor for our cohort, where we were there in South Africa for 2 weeks. We were in Johannesburg, Pietermaritzburg, and a few more places. Dr. Boesak, like I said, was our lead professor. Now, I really got to know him as I was coming up. I'm a child of the Civil Rights Movement, and as I was coming up and learning that more black people than just the black people in the United States were catching hell, I learned more about the situation in South Africa. And one of my main sources for what I was learning was Dr. Boesak. With his prolific writing, he's written over 22 books and has all kinds of doctorate and honorary doctorate awards. But he was, even as he was doing his liberation work, his anti-apartheid activity, which was prolific, he also was doing this writing. He will tell you himself that in 1984, I think it was 1984, he was the organizer, one of the organizers of what was called the United Democratic Front, which was the only non-racial political party that was in South Africa during that time. He told a story today about how the United Democratic Front grew and grew and grew and grew and came to represent so many people of so many different from so many different walks of life as they all got together to do this anti-apartheid fighting. So I first got to know him through his prolific writing. I was blessed enough to be able to meet him in person, and now I'm even blessed enough to be able to call him my friend. There are lots of things that I could say about him, but what I truly want to say is that he is a passionate and wonderful man. He is a child of God. He has put his life on the line for the liberation of God's people, and he continues to do so. We did not have to bring him from South Africa. He was teaching in Berea, Kentucky, in large part because he's not allowed to teach in South Africa, because he is basically banned. What he writes, what he says, is uncompromising in terms of the gospel and in terms of the liberation of God's people. And they're still not ready to hear a whole lot of what he has to say in South Africa. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I forgot to put the sign-in sheet over there. People can sign in on their way out.
Okay. You heard that, right? Sign in on your way out. The Reverend Dr. Allan Bosek.
Thank you very much, my friend and my brother. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and thank you for coming out on Mother's Day. I mean, it's almost like a bit of sacrilege, right? That you do something like this on Mother's Day. But you know, when I think of how the mothers of my people and the women who were in the struggle over such a long time and set such sterling examples of courage and love and uncompromising commitment to what South Africa should be through all those many years. And I think of how our reconciliation process has failed them. It is probably proper that on a day like today, Mother's Day, we talk about reconciliation. Stephen Marsh has asked me to speak on reconciliation. The main ingredients, he says. Okay, so we'll talk about the main ingredients as I understand it. But I already let the cat out of the bag because I called our reconciliation process a failure. Whereas for most people in the United States and elsewhere in the world, South Africa is probably the sterling example of what reconciliation and truth would look like. We are held up everywhere in the world. We are almost exceptional in that sense. Desmond Tutu has said that because of us, reconciliation and forgiveness have become an industry. He was more correct than I think he knew when he said that, because it has become an industry. But making an industry out of it, does it make it more real? So let me begin by let me begin by saying a few things before I talk about the main ingredients. Perhaps as I speak, the main ingredients would become clear. I mean, one would say main ingredients for reconciliation: love, right, and forgiveness, things like that. Hold on with that thought, though, for a bit. In 1993, I was in the leadership of the African National Congress, our liberation movement, which had been the spearhead of our struggle for freedom and justice in South Africa for a long, long time, having started in 1912. And led the struggle through all those decades. And I was in the leadership, and we were talking about what was then only a discussion about a truth commission, same as Chile and Argentina, places like that. And in the middle of our conversation, somebody came and whispered in Nelson Mandela's ear, and President Mandela, not yet president of the country, but president of the African National Congress, asked to be excused. He went out, he came back, and then he says, I need to interrupt your discussion because I was called out to a phone call from Mr. F.W. de Klerk, and you will remember that name, the last white president of South Africa, the man who was credited with having had the foresight and the courage to understand that white people can't continue to rule the land in the way they did, that white supremacy will not last, and so forth, and so forth. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize together with Nelson Mandela. Well, de Klerk was on the phone, and he says, Mr. de Klerk has a proposal for us. The proposal was that we should, instead of talking about a truth commission, we should rather talk of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That had all sorts of consequences. First of all, it sounded beautiful. It sounded just about right. And I remember in the conversation, I raised my hand and I said to the African Congress leadership, look, we've got to be careful what we do with this proposal. Because I'm not against reconciliation at all. I'm a Christian, I'm a preacher. As my life, I know that as a Christian, we can't even talk about reconciliation as an option, according to Paul. We have reconciliation as a ministry entrusted to us by Jesus. And so as God is going around in history reconciling the world unto God's self, that's us. And it's not just about you and me, and it's about the world that needs to be reconciled to God. So I understood all of that. But I said, forgive me for saying so, but I suspect that I know a little bit more about Mr. de Klerk and his motivations that many of you might do. De Klerk is a South African. De Klerk is a good Reformed Christian. De Klerk also understood the whole question of black people and faith in South Africa a lot better than the ANC. The ANC had been away for 30 years in exile. One of the things that they had lost was an understanding of the depth of the ordinary radical spirituality of black people. That the struggle had been carried by a part of the ANC history that the ANC in exile had forgotten, namely anchored in our faith. And so de Klerk knew that when you talk to black people about reconciliation, you talk Bible, you talk Jesus, you talk love, you talk forgiveness. If you play your cards right, you'll get a lot more black people on board on this reconciliation thing than you would with purely political arguments. And he was right. But I said to the ANC in those conversations, just remember that if you're taking on a gospel truth here, reconciliation is not a bookkeeping term. It's a very deep biblical term. It's a very deep Christian term. It carries weight with us in the way that only the gospel can. If you, however, use this term, then you must be ready for the consequences, because the way I understand the Bible, the way I read the gospel, reconciliation is a very radical process. And we have to be sure that we are ready to take those radical consequences of this decision that we will make. And if you think, no, it would make people, like Mr. de Klerk argues, it will pacify black people, it make them more manageable, it will make it easier for us to handle them. The truth is so harsh. If we just hear the truth about South Africa, well, what would that be like? Murder and torture and imprisonment and genocide and killings and land theft and all of that, dehumanization on a scale that in the rest of Africa was not seen. Well, if you do that, then you must remember that those people who have struggled through to this moment and who believed in the gospel have become radicalized in our thinking about what the gospel requires of us. And we can talk about that if we have time. Oh, by the way, talking about time, I see here is no, oh, there is a watch. All right, okay. So, Reverend Stephen, when do you want me to stop talking? At about?
Let's say 5:30.
No. I mean, for me to stop talking. I mean, you're a black preacher, man. You know how we get carried away. Because we love to torture white folks who are used to 12-minute sermons. Okay, I'll thank you. But I won't burden you enough. But I need to tell you the story so that you understand how important it is that we do talk about this. And how important it is that you understand why I am so disappointed and angry. Even though I am not half as angry as the young people are now in my country about this thing. So I say, if you do that, and remember that this decision might come to bite you, because that's what the gospel does. I said this morning to people, I mean, apartheid had for decades used the Bible to justify it, to lie about God, about Jesus, about the message of the Bible, about us. They had built a system, a proper theological construct called the theology of apartheid. And it became the heart of their whole ideology, more so even than the socio-economic and all the other issues that come with it. But you can't use the Bible and abuse the Bible forever. In the class this morning, we talked about that, is that there comes a time when the Holy Spirit simply kicks in her heels and she says, enough. And all your theological constructs and all your justifications and all your abuse of the Bible goes out the window. That's what the Holy Spirit does. And when that happens, we act as if we're all surprised. Oh, how did she do that? Well, she does it all the time. She did it in South Africa as well. So this reconciliation that you will use to pacify people, that will come back to bite you. Well, it suited the ANC, like it suited Mr. de Klerk, to have truth and reconciliation, with the hope that the truth would be too harsh, but reconciliation would ameliorate that some way. The truth would be harsh, but you can't just take the truth and nail them on the truth. You have to have reconciliation with it, because reconciliation will say, oh, this is the truth, but we got to love, and we got to forgive, because that's what the gospel says. But that's abuse of God, that's abuse of the gospel, it's abuse of the scriptures, it's abuse of Jesus, and it's abuse of the faith and the trust of the people. So that was the one thing. Let me shift to 2005. That was 1993. In the meantime, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it handed over its report to the president in 1998. And in 2005, I was in Johannesburg with a meeting. And as we came out of the meeting, I was waylaid, I always think, by these 5 young people. And they were all from Soweto. The meeting was in Johannesburg. They were all from Soweto. And they stopped me and they said, Rev, can we talk to you a bit? I said, yes. And they said, can we talk to you about this reconciliation thing, is the way they put it. I said, okay, so what? They said, well, we've had this reconciliation, it's been going on, but we need to tell you, in Soweto, for us, nothing has changed. Our parents are in the same position they always have been. We still live in the same shacks that we always have lived in. There's been no change in our lives that we can see. White people are no more friendly and open than they have always been. We don't believe in this thing. So I thought, okay, let me push a little bit and evoke the magic name. Now in South Africa, we called Mr. Mandela Madiba. That was a pet name. People sometimes say it's a tribal name, but it isn't. It's a name of honor. It's a love term, so to speak. So we talk about Madiba magic. So if nothing works, then we call upon Madiba magic. And I thought, let me test a little Madiba magic. And I said, well, what about Mr. Mandela? He came out of prison after 27 years. He made that wonderful speech. He urged us to forgive and so forth. Don't you think that that is, oh yeah, says this young boy to me. He says, well, you know, if I was in prison and somebody lets me out and somebody gives me $1 million and that somebody makes me president of the country, I will forgive everybody in sight. Think about what that means. It's now 2015. Sorry, it was 2005. It's now 2018. And how that feeling has grown with young people. So let me tell you another story and come back to Mother's Day. Nomondo Talata is the widow of a man called Fort Talata, who together with 3 other young men, Matthew Goniwe, Sparrow Mkonte for Talata, and so had worked with us in the United Democratic Front. They were leaders in the Eastern Cape, all came from a place called Cradock. Very strong leaders, not only in the community, but they set great examples for the rest of the country, especially for the young people who were so much involved in the struggle. Well, they were stopped at a roadblock in 1985, a police roadblock, and then they disappeared, and then a week later, somebody saw their car burnt out along the side of the road, and then another week later, we heard that they had died under torture in the police cells in Port Elizabeth. Of course, there was the state pathologist, but we know state doctors always lied, so people got money and there was an independent autopsy done. And that independent autopsy pointed out the fact not only that they were tortured, that we knew and expected, but they were tortured at some point with a blow torch, if you can imagine what that meant. So Nomondo Talata was one of the widows. I preached their funeral in Cradock in July of 1985. When Nomondo Talata came to testify before the Amnesty Committee of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996, she sat in her chair across from the policeman who had tortured her husband and killed him. And she opened her mouth and said a few words, and then she stopped. She couldn't speak anymore, but she threw herself backwards, and she uttered a deep, deep, deep wail. She went, ah, for a long time. You could see it was something that was pent up inside of her. All the words in the world failed her. The only thing that to describe her pain and her longing for justice and the long years of suffering and what it meant for her and her children and her community came out in that one cry. There was a journalist who wrote of that cry and of that moment as the signature moment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She says this was the turning point, Nomondo's cry. Well, I spoke to Nomondo Talata last year in October in Cape Town. Her pain has not diminished. She was asked that day to forgive these torturers sitting in front of her. And you know that in the TRC mandate from the Act of Parliament that established, if you wanted amnesty as a policeman or a soldier or whatever for the crimes that you have committed upon the person of the activist, that you only have to say that what she testifies or he testifies is true. So recognition of the truth of the story is what was required. If you recognize that truth and you say, yes, it is true, I did all of this, then the commission can judge that you have now admitted that you are eligible for amnesty. However, in the amnesty process, almost invariably, not almost invariably, the victims who had described their torture or the way they lost their children or their mothers or their fathers would be asked and asked and asked and pressed, say, would you not forgive this person? Because the idea was that we have truth and reconciliation. So reconciliation means forgiveness, even if the person doesn't ask for it, and even if the person asks for it and doesn't mean it. Like Captain Hechter, who said, oh, I'm sorry for what I've done. Then he went out and he told journalists, oh, I'm not sorry for what I've done. I would do it again. He said, I did it for God, I did it for my country, I did it for my people. I'm not sorry. I just said it because they wanted to hear it. Nomondo Talata is in Craddock today, and she is celebrating Mother's Day. And her pain has not been healed. So maybe that's good that we talk about this stuff on Mother's Day. So already you have an idea of what the main ingredients of reconciliation might be. But I'm now tempted to say that Willie Jennings, who was at Duke at some time, is now in Princeton, a theologian, that Willie Jennings has written that perhaps the first thing that Christians must do with reconciliation is to ban the word altogether. He said, I suggest that we don't even use it anymore because we have abused it so awfully and for so long. And if you so think of South Africa's genesis of our reconciliation, and you think of what those kids said to me that night in Soweto, and you think of the situation now where there has been no justice, and I'll talk about justice because that's important for our people. And you think of Nomondo Kalata's cry as a woman and as a mother, then the main ingredient for reconciliation would probably have to be silence on the subject for a while. Christians we are so glib. I mean, words like reconciliation and forgiveness tumble from our lips as if it's the most automatic thing in the world. We've got to be careful, though, what that does to people and what it means, and perhaps what it does to Jesus when we talk like this. But W.E. Du Bois, talking about main ingredients, wrote in 1957, 2 volumes, wonderful book. But in that first volume, he raises 4 questions that I think would be important for us as it frames our idea of what reconciliation might be. Du Bois, in 57, asked the question, what does integrity do in the face of oppression? That's number 1. Number 2, what does honesty do in the face of deception? Number 3, what does decency do in the face of insult? And number 4, how does virtue meet brute force. Integrity, honesty, decency, virtue. That is another way of framing reconciliation, looking at it. Did South Africa's process have integrity? Did it have honesty? Did it have decency? Did it have virtue? Did it transfer decency and honesty and integrity and virtue on our political process? Did it transfer decency and honesty and integrity and virtue onto the relationships between white and black people in my country? I don't think so. So remember that apartheid was declared a crime against humanity by the international community. There are, in the 20th century, only two political systems that were to be declared crimes against humanity. That was Nazism in Germany and apartheid in South Africa. Because a war crime is a crime that you can do to one person or a group of soldiers, do under cover of war, do horrible crimes, like you send a drone and you target a wedding party where 34 people die, 13 of them children. That's a war crime. But a crime against humanity is when you target specifically a whole group of people because of their religion or the color of their skin, their ethnicity, and you don't target them for one physical attack. You target them for systematic discrimination, systematic exploitation, systematic degradation and dehumanization. And you do it not accidentally, but by law that is created to give you the space and to give you the guise of legality to do all of that to people for generations on. And that's a crime against humanity. That's what apartheid was. When we sat down to talk about how we would deal with this crime against humanity in the early 1990s, the question came up, is there not a historical precedent for dealing with crimes against humanity? And yes, of course there was. Nazi Germany was faced with the Nuremberg trials. That was the world's response. That's the only historic precedent that we have. So for crimes on that scale for such a long time, for so many people, that's what you do. You see it as a crime, you handle it as a crime, you punish it as a crime. And you hang those who need to be hanged, and you put in jail those who need to be put in jail, and so forth. That was the example that we had historically. What did South Africa black people do? They said, no, we recognize that this is a crime against humanity, but we would not treat you as the criminals you are. We would be willing to say to you, we will say that what you did was in pursuit of a political goal, namely apartheid. Those who perpetrated great wrongs against the people will be punished if found guilty, not in a court of law, but in the rooms of an amnesty commission that was sitting down and judging these issues. But what we mostly want from you, black South Africans said, is not to punish you, but to say, how about we talk not about criminal justice as revenge or retribution, but we talk about the need for political justice. So if we see this as a political goal that you pursued, and we offer you political justice, that means the very fact that you are sitting around a table with us negotiating a future in which you are not excluded as you excluded us for almost 400 years, but you are included. That in itself is justice in a way that we haven't thought about it. But we went further. In doing that, we then say, so in this talking of political justice, we are no longer talking about victors' justice. So we won the battle against apartheid. There are people who say, no, South African blacks and whites came together because nobody won this war. It's not true. That's only true if you think of the struggle against apartheid in a military fashion. Of course, the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, since it was formed in 1960, could never be a match for the South African army, which is the best trained, best equipped army on the continent. It could never deal with a government that had all sorts of weapons, including nuclear weapons, at its disposal. We could never match up to what the South African white policemen and army people were taught by the Mossad and the Israelis and the FBI and MI6. We didn't have that access. And if you think about it, if a people like South Africa's black people have to take 300 years to make up their minds, okay, now we're going to, well, let's not say 300 years. Let's say from 1948 to 1960, we're going to fight these violent people with violence of our own. Why does it take you almost 50 years to make that decision? And why, when you make that decision, you do some things. You plant a bomb here, and you plant a bomb there, and you kill maybe, what, 15 white people? 20 white people? Since 1960? Over 30 years? Is that all you can do? Think about it. And so, if you can't make a plan to say, this is a violent struggle, this is a war, so we will treat you as if we are in a war, it can mean either that you're so incompetent that you should give up the struggle altogether, or it means that your disposition is such that every decision about violence that you make leaves you worried and with a bad conscience. A soldier with a conscience is no good. So what is it that we didn't get that far? So that's a discussion. But the bitter discussion is why I'm arguing that you can only say that black people lost the struggle against whites in South Africa against apartheid in the military, or not lost, but we couldn't win the struggle, is what they were saying. But that's not true. Between 1976 and 1983, we had sporadic, fragmented protests, demonstrations, uprisings all across the country. The Soweto uprising was not just that one day on June 16, 1976, when the government shot hundreds of children, and afterwards laying down clearly that we are able and capable and ready and willing to do anything to uphold white supremacy and white power and white privilege. So all of that was happening. And by 1983 we thought, but we need to stop the fragmentation. We need to mobilize the people. We need to bring unity to all our efforts. That's why I called for the formation of the United Democratic Front. And it was amazing how ready the people were for that. We came together in ways that we have never seen before. When we say that the United Democratic Front became the largest non-violent, non-racial movement in the history of the country, that means we did what the ANC in all of its history could not do. We fell back on the strategies of nonviolent resistance, what Albert Luthuli called militant nonviolence, in the streets, and everywhere, because that was our example. And we thought the ANC, who had chosen since 1960 to have an underground struggle, so cells of Mkonte with Sizwe here and there, who would do some damage there and do some damage there and kill a person here and kill a person there. We said, no, that is not the way we should handle the struggle. Let us make this an above-ground movement. We will mobilize in the open so that everybody in the world can see what the South African government is truly like. So if they kill us, let us kill us in the sight of all the world, not silently in the middle of the night here and there with a story tomorrow morning, we've killed 15 terrorists. And so let their partners, all these Western governments, from the United States to Britain, to European governments, to Japan, let them all see what they are supporting in South Africa. So the children that the South African government shot down in the streets were the children that were shot down by the United States. Let them see that and let them know. And so we decided that that is what we will do. We also said we will make this a struggle not as an organization with centralized leadership, but we will let an organic leadership grow. So we did. And we asked for organizations to be formed. If you want to be, you could not become an individual member of the UDF. You could only become a member through an organization, because we wanted the people to organize. We wanted the people to mobilize. We wanted the people to bring themselves together. They must, in their little town or in the cities, wherever it is, they must come together and say, as an organization, we decide to join this struggle. By the time we launched, we had 500 organizations in August of 1983. By the time we ended in 1990, we had over 1,000 organizations representing millions of people. We started our work in 1983. By 1985, we had put the government under such pressure that the first state of emergency was called. In 1987, a second state of emergency was called. Not letting up on the first one, but making the area for the emergency larger and larger and larger. And that is a state of emergency, as you know, is very much like martial law. It's military rule. The police and the army get a blank check. Everything you do is okay. You can do it with impunity because it is for national security. And national security is a magic word, as you know. So by the time, in 2 years' time, the government was so worried that it did all of these things. By 1985, we called for, because we said we don't believe in violence, we called for a day of prayer to pray for the fall, for the removal of the apartheid regime. Now that's another story. I mean, you won't believe how a little prayer could cause havoc in political circles in South Africa. By 1986, 1985, we were working very clearly on the international front. We had churches in the sanctions and divestment and boycott issue for the apartheid regime. We had churches, we had students, we had universities, we had colleges. In the United States, colleges and churches played a singularly important role in all of that. And you will remember that in 1985 or beginning of 1986, Congress passed the anti-apartheid legislation with the sanctions. Mr. Reagan was on the throne at that time, and you remember that he vetoed it. And then Senate came together in a greater miracle than you can't even imagine today. Republicans and Democrats, non-partisan group of people, got the Senate to say, we overrule this veto. I mean, is that even possible to think of? Yeah, when it happened, I was there. I saw it. The first time in the history of the United States where a veto of a president was overruled by Senate on a foreign policy matter. Think about what that means. So by the time we got to 1989, Mr. de Klerk, who was just elected in the place of P.W. Botha, knew exactly where he stood because the people of South Africa were so clear and so persistent in their resistance, so faithful in their struggle, that he knew they had no chance. That battle we won. We won the sport boycott, we won everything. There was not a place that South Africa could go in the world except for Margaret Thatcher's Britain, where they felt welcomed. George Bush the first George Bush, by December of 1989, was looking at legislation to get American banks to change their attitude towards South Africa. No longer any more new loans, no longer the rollover of loans as they had in the past. No, we were going to put them under such financial pressure they would have no choice. That was all between 1983 and 1990. 1989, that was, what was it, December 1989. February 1990, de Klerk made his famous speech on February 8, declaring that Nelson Mandela would come out of prison, that the ANC would be unbanned. On February 11th, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. That's between 1983 and 1990. You're telling me there was a battle that we could not win? No. And so reconciliation must not be seen as a negotiated compromise because we could not win the struggle against apartheid. We made the decision for reconciliation despite the fact that we were not only the victims of 400 years of oppression and genocide and dehumanization, but because despite the fact that we were all of that. That's where we stood. In 1985 already. And that's the time when the South African the government began its secret negotiations. Not the proper negotiations of 1993 and 1992 and 1993, but the secret negotiations with the ANC in secret places. We found that out only later. So the idea that reconciliation was a weak compromise because we could not win the struggle is wrong. I still believe that reconciliation, the fact that we made that decision, is the right and foundationally righteous decision. I wouldn't have had it otherwise. My problem is with the way in which reconciliation was managed to carefully avoid the restoration of justice and dignity and peace in South Africa. So if you don't take victors' justice and you don't take victims' justice, what else is left? You create what we then called survivors' justice. And that means that South Africa's black people were saying to South Africa's white people, their oppressors, you know what? We will consider ourselves, all of us, you and us, as having survived this catastrophe called apartheid. So we will include you in the writing of the new constitution. We will make sure that your rights are protected. We will make sure that your children will have a future despite 400 years of what you have done. That's survivor's justice. That meant that fundamentally we made a choice here in terms of justice. There is a justice that is revenge for the dead. That's what the Holocaust people keep on saying, and they have every right to say that. We must avenge the dead and hang everyone that we can find, or kill him, or anything like that. South Africa says, no, we're not into justice that revenges the dead. We are into justice that affirms the living. And so, we cannot say what our dead would want us to do. But we are not assuming that what they want of us is to kill you in revenge. What we are assuming, knowing who we are, is that they would say, find a way forward. Find a way to talk about a common, shared future. Find a way to talk about forgiveness. Find a way toward justice. So the political justice, having gone to survivors' justice, having gone to justice for the living, now becomes social justice, because the only way that white people in South Africa could even begin to respond to such magnanimity is to say, what can we do to make sure of the reciprocity of justice for what you have done? So let us work for systemic undoing of all the injustices we have built, and the systemic doing of new forms of justice. And so we will look at the economy, we will look at social issues, we will look at social cohesion, we will look at human relationships, and we will do everything, not just a personal forgiveness thing. That's what the TRC became. So the TRC, acknowledging that it was a crime against apartheid, in other words, directed against whole groups of people, turned around and made the crime of apartheid an individual thing. That's how we ended up, personalized, that's how we ended up with one policeman who was a torturer and one victim. And so then the aim became, oh, how can we bring these two people together? Oh, can you forgive him? Can you forgive him? Can you forgive him? Can you forgive him? And when we finally said, well, we're not sure, then the Archbishop said, well, you know, Jesus forgave, even while he was hanging on the cross. Ooh, that's for a Christian. And when that didn't work, we said, oh, we must do it because of Ubuntu. That's Africa. Your humanity is caught up with my humanity. I am diminished if I diminish anything about you, if I discriminate against you, if I hurt you, if I do damage to you, I do damage to myself. And so for the two of us to regain our common humanity, I must return your humanity to you by forgiving you. Well, I'm not against that either. But I am against using forgiveness as a tool to pacify and to avoid justice. We haven't seen any of the social justice. You can't individualize a crime like that, and you do nothing about the systemic injustices that were done. I mean, the Truth Commission worked with physical violence one-on-one. Who threw whom out of the helicopter to see which height will cause the fastest death. That they did. They did that. Who concocted this poison to be tested on this person? They did that too. How many times can we beat his head against the wall so when he dies we could say he did this in his frustration, not that we tortured him like they did with Steve Biko. So, I mean, so the one individual against the other individual. But there were systemic crimes. The violence of apartheid was not only physical. Every time they robbed us of our land, they kicked us out of our homes. Every time they made room for themselves so that white South Africa ended up with 87% of the land that they stole from the indigenous people. Every single time they put a child in a Bantu education system that was designed to let that black child know that there is only so far you can go. Because what is the use, Verwoerd said, who devised the system of Bantu education, what is the use of telling black people that they can become something that they can never become? What's the use of teaching them to think like philosophers? They won't ever be that. What's the use of telling a person who is doomed and destined to work in my garden or in my house as a domestic servant, cleaning my toilets, looking after my children while I force her to leave her children 400 miles away in some homeland? What's the use of teaching that woman that she can become somebody with dignity? Because that's not what God has wanted for you. So what about that violence? What about that violence, that makes a child believe, I am nothing, I am worth nothing, I can only be serving white people for the rest of my life. What about that violence? So they failed us on the question of violence, they failed us on the question of systemic justice, they failed us on all the issues that matter. It's 5 o'clock, so what are the ingredients of reconciliation? There was a point where I thought to myself, I don't know, and I don't care. But Jesus has a strange way of holding on to you and won't let go. So I have to think, can we have it again? Can we do it over? The young people now think, no. The young people call our reconciliation process a fraud, and they call Nelson Mandela a sellout. Politically, they're right. But as a Christian, I have to think, if God would give up on me as easily as I was tempted to give up on reconciliation, genuine reconciliation, where would I end up? And knowing who God is, what God does with me is what God intends with societies and with the world that has to be reconciled with God. So do I believe in reconciliation as South Africans have experienced it? No. But do I believe in reconciliation that is clear and revolutionary and radical? Yes, I do. Do I think it's possible? Yes, not because of us. There's nothing exceptional about South Africans, but there's everything exceptional about Jesus. That is what we hope. Okay, so it's 5 o'clock. If I may have a bit of water, I'll be grateful. Oh, you see? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, so no, the battle in South Africa now really is it at all possible for us to go back? There are some people who say, we must have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on socio-economic issues because that's where the greatest injustices are still being done. Other people say, but you know, because we have not been honest, I mean, maybe I should end with this. I think the biggest misstep that we made was in making ourselves believe that reconciliation is cheap, that it has no costs. And you can't get away with cheap reconciliation. So a reconciliation that leaves systems of oppression intact, that's cheap reconciliation. It's a lie. And reconciliation that is reconciliation only because white people are left untouched with their wealth and their property and their stolen land. That's not reconciliation. So here's the other story. I can't tell you the context of the story, except that it is very important. But I was talking with somebody from Europe who had been part of this whole process for a long time. And when we talked about where we went off the rails and the world kept on calling us this great reconciling nation, the rainbow nation of God. And we believed ourselves to be the rainbow nation of God. And we talked to ourselves and we patted ourselves on the back as how much better we are than those Ugandans and those Bosnians, those people who kill each other all the time just for nothing. Oh, you know. When we talked about this and said, why did we do these, why did we make these mistakes? He was saying to me, just remember that in the 1990s, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, South Africa was so important because it had to be a good news story for the rest of the world. But what is the price of that good news story? If we are, for whom is this good news meant? The way I hear Jesus, good news is meant for the poor and the prisoners and the captives and the despised and the lowly of this world. But if good news is only good news for your oppressor, and if South Africa is great because we didn't take white people's money, or we didn't say to white people, give back our land, so reconciliation without restitution is worthless. And I've been told this morning that Lutherans don't bring their Bible to church. Well, my mother wouldn't let me out the house without my Bible on a Sunday morning. But I'm sure you all remember the story of Zacchaeus. Here's a commercial. I will tell you only 2 minutes of that story right now, but if you want to read the whole story, you got to read my book called Radical Reconciliation. And the wonderful thing about Zacchaeus is that Zacchaeus actually did understand that reconciliation is costly. That's why, and he understood that reconciliation is not possible without remorse and without forgiveness and without repentance and without restitution. That's why he said that day in his conversation with Jesus and with the crowd who hated him so much that he went early and got into that tree. Everybody thinks, I think, he got into that tree because he was such a small man. Or maybe. I think he got into that tree because that was the safe place for him to be. He was hated. He was a tax collector. The crowd would have eaten him up for breakfast. He went in the tree. That's where he was sitting, watching. But he speaks with Jesus and he says, I will give back fourfold of what I had stolen from anybody else. And the rest, if there is anything left, I will give that to the poor. That's radical, but that's reconciliation. That's what you should do. I told that story once when I said in South Africa that I am convinced that white Christians in South Africa love Mandela more than they love Jesus. Ooh. I spent the next 3 days having to explain to the radio, to television, to newspapers, what I meant, because white people were so upset. I said, well, I mean, it's clear to me, when you talk about reconciliation, you'd rather go to Mandela than go to Jesus, because Mandela will talk stuff like national unity, and we've got to forget the past, and all of that. If you go to Jesus, Jesus will say, why don't you read your Bible? Do you know what Zacchaeus and I talked about? That's what you must do. But that is exactly what they do not want to do. Give back, and give back fourfold. No, I will keep my 27 farms. By the way, this is not a myth. There was actually a minister in the cabinet of the National Party who had 27 farms. Now, what on earth you do with 27 farms, I don't know. My farm. Yeah, well. But, so Zacchaeus does that. And Zacchaeus does not hold back. And Zacchaeus has this conversation with Jesus in front of the crowd. Me, I would pull the trick that David did. Now, Psalm 51 is one of the most beautiful psalms, right? We use that in confession in church all the time. Give me a clean heart, oh God. All that lovely stuff. That's all true. It's all wonderful. But then David says, against you and against you alone I have sinned. But that's not true. Why does he privatize a thing, making it a thing between him and God, when it was first a thing between him and Bathsheba, and then him and her husband? So why does he not say, I have sinned against Bathsheba? Why does he exclude Bathsheba from his confession and his remorse? Zacchaeus doesn't do that. He says to God, I have stolen from these people, and I will give back to these people what I have taken from them. That's reconciliation. That's clear. And the thing is, it's only when he's done all of that that Jesus says, I want to come and have dinner at your place tonight. Because that, in the culture of that time, is the ultimate inclusion. It's the ultimate honor to break bread with somebody. And so Zacchaeus has what white people have not experienced except for now and then. To break bread with reconciled people in a reconciled community. But you can't get there. You can't skip remorse, and you can't skip repentance, and you can't skip asking for forgiveness, and you can't skip restitution, and as if by magic be transported to a reconciled state. We haven't done any of that, but we are the rainbow nation of God. You can't have that. Well, anyway, no, I'm not talking anymore. You gave up your Mother's Day to come and put your question. So please do that so that we can have a conversation. I'll appreciate that.
I had the honor of spending 3 weeks in South Africa in March, in Cape Town, Johannesburg, over to Kaimouth. And something that I had learned about that you wouldn't necessarily hear about here is the president was talking about, and you'll probably have to correct me with this, the whites giving back the property, the farm property, that there is something the president was going to be doing with that. How's that going?
Well, I'm hoping that it'll be going for the first time. The commission, the Truth Commission, never spoke about the question of returning the land. The negotiations did not insist that before a national government of unity was formed, or just as the first act of a national government of unity, the return of the land has to be the issue. But we tricked the people with two things. In 1990, when de Klerk made the announcement that the ANC and all the liberation movements would be unbanned, they can come back, and the prisoners would be freed from the prisons, he also pushed through the white parliament. One of the last acts of the white parliament was a white paper that talked about land return. He called it restitution. But he specified all the land that is government property, that is not used by government properly, would be returned. Well, that was a trick. That's not restitution. Because it meant that not a single white person would have to give back any land that they had stolen. And the act further on also talked about illegal taking of land. What does that mean? When for 100 years, for every land theft, you have enacted a law. It was legal under apartheid law to steal people's land, as it was legal under colonizers' law from 1910, the 1913 Land Act, the 1936 Land Act, the Group Areas Act in 1956, 57. I mean, it's all legal. It's not moral, it's not right, it's still theft, but it's legal. So don't say illegal land taken. So that was the one trick. The second trick was even more insidious. South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I'm so proud when I think of how from the very beginning we had known that if we have a Bill of Rights, you talk about the rights of everybody. So we have rights for children and rights for women. So the gender justice thing for LGBTQI people, they can get married with all the rights that heterosexual people have. There's just no question. So I'm very, very proud of that. But the longest clause in our Constitution is the private property clause. So all of a sudden, this Constitution that is based on our understanding of justice that I just explained, they've gone through that whole process, based on Ubuntu, the common humanity thing, that whole Constitution based on reconciliation, hides within itself one of the greatest ongoing injustices in my country, namely the land that now belongs to whoever it belongs to is untouchable. If you try to take the land away, it's unconstitutional. And you know, in those debates, the Constitution becomes far more sacred than the sacred text. The Bible has no patch on the Constitution. So that is a great deceit. And so I'm back to W.E. Du Bois. In the face of that deceit, what would honesty and decency and integrity do? Well, we try to respond to that. And so the whole land question has become a heated issue over the last 10 years. And again, it is the younger people who kept on pushing, kept on pushing, kept on pushing, kept on pushing. So finally, the ANC decided, no. Then there's a smaller political party, but the most vocal, the most radical political party in our parliamentary system. It's called the Economic Freedom Fighters, and you heard right. That's what they call themselves. And they fight on every issue. Every single speech is an entertainment bar none. So they tabled a motion. And because the African National Congress is caught more and more and more in terms of the web of lies and deceitfulness that they have spun from 1985 onwards, they can't now any longer, now that the issue is so public, they can't say, oh, we don't want our people to have back their land. But the EFF says it's our proposal in Parliament. If you want to join us, now here is the smallest political, not the smallest, a smaller political party, but the ANC's most bitter enemy in Parliament, inviting the ANC with a large majority to do what it said way back before they knew what power and money and wealth was. We will return the land to our people. But they couldn't now make a new proposal. Parliamentary rule says you can only come and join the EFF in their proposal. So they become a seconder to the motion, so to speak. It's huge humiliation, of course, but they have to do that. That's their first problem. So they had done that. So Parliament has now taken a decision that land will be taken away, will be expropriated, without compensation, because that was the other issue. For years since 1994, we had land could be returned, but with proper compensation. Willing buyer, willing seller principle. Well, white people, clever as they have always been, said it's fine with us, but we talk market prices, right? So the land that I have stolen from you, I will now sell back to you at market prices. And so that was the thing that bothered our people. And so in the conversations, the ANC was totally overrun by this. Now, this is the third problem that the ANC is now facing. The president that you're talking about is Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa is a good a nice man. Let me get that out of the way. It's on record, just in case they're listening, which they are, as you well know. But Cyril Ramaphosa, when I got to know him in the 1980s, he was the general secretary of the largest trade union the Union of Mine Workers in South Africa. He was one of the most radical young men to have crossed my path, and he has helped me understand how to put in theological language, how to turn my theological radical language into political language, and that was also necessary. But Cyril Ramaphosa, who was this poor fellow in 1985, is now one of the country's richest men. He is a billionaire. And he is as ostentatious with his wealth as all the other rich people who became, blacks who became rich by the deals that they made with the white government. I said to Lakeshore Church this morning, we have, within a short span of time, South Africa now has 71,000 dollar millionaires. You must think about what that means. If I become a millionaire tomorrow, the first question they will ask me, oh, what are you talking about? Are you talking South African rand? Are you talking US dollars? If you're talking South African rand, you don't count, because $1 is worth 12 rand today as we speak here. So I'm not really rich. I'm trying to be rich. I'm pretending to be rich, but I'm not really rich. So Cyril Ramaphosa has an amassed wealth, we think, of 61.5 billion rand. So he's a dollar billionaire in the country. He is the same one who last year made a bid on a buffalo for 15 million rand. He buys buffaloes that cost 15 million. The young people who hear this and hear with the other ear the excuses of the government how we can't have free education because it's so expensive, say, what in the world are you talking about? Oh, that's Cyril. But how did Cyril Ramaphosa get so rich? Because of the rich white folks, whom he helped protect, so that they would not be giving up any of their wealth, they would not give up any of the land that they have. And so now, who is he going to listen to? His white friends are very angry about this. We're not going big on land. There's one chap who actually is a chairperson of some agricultural organization in South Africa. He says, this is scandalous, he says. Taking our land away from us, it's nothing less than theft. Hello? So what is Cyril going to do? Is he going to please the people by doing what is right? Or is he going to please his rich friends by doing what is comfortable for them? That's not a light dilemma to deal with. And so that's where he's going to be pushed on. So if he or the ANC tries to get around this thing somehow, saying, well, you know, it's too difficult to change the Constitution, we shouldn't touch the Constitution, it's a slippery slope, the people are not going to accept this. So that's where we are with that debate. But it has become one of the major issues in our political discourse in South Africa right now. So, yes, sir.
My African history is weak, so bear with me. But isn't there, I would like you to contrast Zimbabwe with what you're saying. It's another model of essentially a change in the cultural leadership.
Yeah. Well, you must remember two things about Zimbabwe. And let me back up to say, it has been my experience that people in the Western world, in the United States, never knew about Zimbabwe, except when Zimbabwe was in the news for having taken white people's land. That's when Zimbabwe became a topic of discussion here. Everybody upset. How can you do that? Well, keep that in mind. I'm not saying it was right, I'm saying just keep it in mind. two things you need to remember about Zimbabwe is when Zimbabwe, there they had actually won the war against Rhodesian colonists and Ian Smith's people, even though they were backed by the British and all of that. When that happened in 1979, there was, in the discussions to end the war and to bring about the change in government and let democracy come to Zimbabwe, the key word there was also reconciliation. And I might be wrong, but I think the person who proposed that Zimbabwe should think of reconciliation was Margaret Thatcher. Now, how in the world you would even believe Margaret Thatcher is beyond me. But Zimbabwe took that seriously. Why? Also because when Robert Mugabe, and I was not a part of those conversations, but I was present for 2 days in London in Grosvenor House when those discussions took place, invited by the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. And I listened to the arguments. And Britain said, when the land question came up, because Robert Mugabe pushed and pushed on the land issue, he said, for us, it's the land issue, it's the land issue. I don't mind sharing a future with white people, but it's the land issue. Margaret Thatcher said, look, don't worry about it. We will make the funds available for you to compensate white people for the land that they will have to give up. Fast forward 20 years later, not a single word of those promises have been kept. In 1999, 2000, Thabo Mbeki got so desperate to help Zimbabwe when this crisis was brewing and you could see this is going to blow up, that he went with this request to Britain: won't you please make good on those promises? Well, by then we were talking to somebody else, Tony Blair, I think, I'm not sure. And when Britain refused, he had to go to the Europeans, who rightfully said to him, why are you talking to us? Zimbabwe is not our colony, it's Britain's colony. So, again, that failed, no money. And it was because of the failure of those promises that in the end, the veterans who had been in the war said to Mugabe, we're tired of waiting. We will go and take that land because we fought, we bled, some of us died for this land. We're not taking this nonsense anymore. We will invade. He, as a politician, had no choice. And so, because they did not find a solution for managing this issue, because it's not just something that happens like this. We fully understand this is something that has to be managed and carefully. That's where the Zimbabwe thing came. And people who talk about the injustices done to white farmers in Zimbabwe without talking about the injustices of hundreds of years of dispossession of those same people and of the war that had been fought and of the compromises that had been made upon the basis of an accepted reconciliation. Again, taking the people for granted and deceiving the people with those words. If you don't talk about both those things and the sequence in which it happens and the consequences of those wrong decisions made on the side of Britain and elsewhere, then we're not having an honest conversation. So I always say to people, don't let us say to South Africa, oh, that's the big thing that people, of course, now say, oh, we're another Zimbabwe, we're another Zimbabwe. We're not another Zimbabwe. But if you go on the way you are going on right now, we will have another Zimbabwe. If Parliament dithers and oohs and ahs and hums and haws about this thing and doesn't do it, and we don't do it properly. And we have it all. We say to them, look, we're not saying take this land and give it to people and then walk away. We are saying, remember that for all these hundreds of years, those of us who owned the land and lost the land have not been allowed to keep up with modern agricultural methods. So teach our people. I'm not saying run to Monsanto. That's from the hell into a different hell. But teach our people how to deal with these issues. Don't just say, here is the land, set them up for failure, and when in a year's time nothing happens on the land, then we turn around and say, you see, we told you. Don't we told you us on this issue. It's far too important. And so that the EFF has finally forced the African National Congress to take this decision. Parliament has now taken this decision. And the government must follow up on this decision. It's the best places that we have been in 20 years on this particular subject. I'm hoping that honesty and decency and integrity and virtue will prevail. And if it doesn't, then we will face a Zimbabwe. There's no doubt about that. You have no idea how angry the youth is today with the fact that we have been lied to for so long, that we have been told everywhere we went how wonderful we are. There's, in the most recent book that I have written, another commercial, called Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood-Red Waters, I have a chapter on the deification of Nelson Mandela and what that meant for us. And the demonization of some other person, a security policeman who was one of the vilest torturers and murderers of the apartheid era. His name is Eugene de Kock. But the two stories of those two men juxtaposed is a classic example of what South Africans have done and what we should have done and how we have gone wrong on that particular issue. So if you want to know more about that, read the book, as they say. But the Zimbabwe question is only an example of what happens when politics bases itself on deceit. And we, now that we have been given a second chance on this issue, the country is not yet burning. We have not yet invaded white people's land by our hundreds and our thousands. We have not yet done that. But I can tell you today, it will happen if we deceive the people again on this matter. Yes, ma'am.
When I'm listening to you, I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but it feels like there's similar things that go on in this country. We have a land tenure system that's based on things like property tax and wealth. And if a rich person wants to get hold of a neighborhood and they build some houses there, the property taxes go up. And if enough rich people come there, the property taxes go up so much that the middle class or poorer people have to move out. And that whole system leads to segregation. And here we've got thousands of homelessness in Dane County, homeless people in Dane County, and we don't have enough affordable housing because the market is tight. And it just seems like that. And then we have the corporations getting public, what's it called, public domain or something, to be able to put oil pipelines.
Eminent public domain.
Domain to put pipelines across people's land. And it just seems like we just take that system for granted here. We just assume that's the way it is. You can't really do anything about it. And it's only right because people have investments and they have to be able to make money off their investments. And we don't think about the fact that it's not right to have thousands and millions of homeless people.
No, well, you see, that's the thing. That's a very good question. But that's the thing. Capitalism skews your mind. It messes up your thinking. When it becomes normalized that people, because they are wealthy and powerful, can do these things, Of course, we must see these things in a broader systemic way as well. There is this disturbing study of political scientists at Princeton University and Northwestern University. I think the study is from 2012, where they asked the question, is the United States really a democracy? And they come to the conclusion that the United States is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy or it's a plutocracy, because they say the US only, the US politics and the systems of government and the policies are all one-sidedly influenced by people with wealth and corporations. And that is why you have this crazy thing that nobody in the world knows why you have it, never mind how you think it's working, where your laws are not written by your representatives, but written by the lobbyists. I can't even begin to wrap my mind around this wonderful American expression that comes in handy in moments like this. How do you wrap your mind around that? Well, they say what the US has is incidental democracy. And they mean by that, where on an incidental basis, what the rich people and the corporations, the 1% want, if that what they want happens to coincide with what ordinary people also want, that's when democracy happens. But it's only on an incidental basis. It's a very insightful study because it's also such a lesson for us in the rest of the world to learn, where not anymore, but so uncritically, everything that is American, because we believe you guys, is great. Does it work? It's great. Is it right? No, but it's great. And so we want to be great. So it's, that mindset is changing. I'm looking forward to the day when Americans can make that connection. And if you can make the connection between what you have said and what you call gentrification here, it happens mostly to poor neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, and sometimes black neighborhoods that are not so poor. But when I look at what gentrification does, for me, it's just another form of forced removal that we had in a part. The point is, if you can make that connection, if you can see the systemic way in which it works, if you can see the deliberateness behind, or nothing of this happens by accident, if you can see the evil of money having such influence in politics, how it excludes 90% of the people in reality, if you can make those connections, then we can begin to think of a civil society in the United States that can really look at systemic issues. What civil society is doing now is wonderful, although up to now it's led by the young people. Black Lives Matter young people, March for Our Lives young people. But that is not enough yet. I don't know whether they make all those systemic connections. The church is not very much with Black Lives Matter. And I'm not sure that they want us there very much anymore. I hope that I'm wrong. And these young people will go on the streets time and time again, and they will not ask their pastor for permission. Think of where we are and how far we are from the circle, the center of where things happen. And think how different that was in the 1980s. We would not have been able to change the mind of the American government if it were not for the churches, together with the students and the colleges and so forth and so forth. But I came to the US in the midst of all of that, and I went back to South Africa, and you will have no idea how strengthened and how encouraged I felt because of you guys. And I knew that I would be going back into God knows what, but I thought, that's all right, because I know that international solidarity is so strong. It's one of the reasons why I look at the Palestinian situation, I think, it's so much worse than we had under apartheid, is number one. But number two, what we had by the 1980s is what Palestinians still don't have. That's honest international solidarity with their situation and their cause. And we don't talk enough about that in our churches. But while we are ignoring the Palestinians, the young people of Black Lives Matter are making those connections. And when they see we are not making those connections, what in the world will make us think that they will even trust us? They're doing all right without the churches. Not everywhere, thank God, because in Ferguson the church is very much in the struggle. But when you've said Ferguson and Oakland and maybe one or two other places, what else can we mention? I don't know. And so we can only become a genuine movement for change, which is so necessary when we make these connections and when we see how things come together and when we understand our struggles. I keep on saying to our people back home, remember, our struggle is a global struggle. I say to African Americans here, don't let them tell you all the time how much of a minority you are. That's nonsense. You're only a minority as far as they are concerned. In the world, with all of us, you are a vast majority. We can do amazing stuff if we think about it. And like Desmond Tutu used to say, we will say to white people, why don't you come and join the winning side? Aren't you tired of losing? So I get so excited when I see these young people. This book that I just written, the Pharaoh's book, is based on what is happening in what I call the new revolutions, and all led by young people. And my points of reference is the United States and South Africa and Palestine. And it's when you start to think about it, what's happening is tremendous. And we have to find a way as a church. And I don't know how we're going to do it except to pray to Jesus to help us find a way to weasel ourselves in. Because we have to regain so much of our integrity that we have lost or given away for the young people to believe in us. In South Africa, it was the same thing. The young people went on the streets because of socio-economic injustices in the fees must fall movement. And they said, you've got to scrap fees for tertiary education because our people can't afford that. We come from the townships. My parents still work for the same low wages that they did 30 years ago. How can they say, but I want a university education. I want to go to college. I want to do something. But your fees are just too high. And the government had this excuse and that excuse and that excuse. Zuma was saying to the young people, you know, it will cost us 2.5 billion rand just for this year to subsidize you a little bit more. And the young people say, we understand that. But is it also true that you are planning to buy a new aeroplane that will cost more than 5 billion rand? Now, if you give up your airplane, which you don't need, and put that money where it must be with education, we don't have a conversation. It's not necessary to talk about it anymore because the problem will be solved. And so young people have done that, but the churches were not with them. But when the young people had pushed and pushed, and Zuma became more and more exposed for what he was with all his corruption, and the cry became, oh, Zuma must fall, Zuma must fall. And all the people in the country and the churches joined with statements, Zuma must. The young people said, okay, Zuma must fall, but where were you when we needed you? Where were you when we marched? Where were you when they shot tear gas at us? Right in front of you. So why would we believe you now? That's how far we have fallen back. And so the church in the United States must really ask serious questions of ourselves, about ourselves, and see whether we can regain what, and I know I'm not lying when I talk about a church that had a prophetic voice. Only 30 years ago, I know because I was here. And let me end with this. I often felt, you know the story. I'm getting back with my Bible that you guys will have to go and check out. You know that story where Jesus heals the lame man who was brought by his friends, and they just chopped up the roof and let him down. And Jesus said that he was healed because of the faith of his friends, not his faith. He had given up already by that time. His friends never did. I felt like that sometimes, that I would come here, and I was on the verge of giving up. I just seen too much pain and too much trouble and too much tear gas and too much blood. And then I come here and I talk to you guys and I see what you're doing on our behalf. And I think this is what that man must have felt like. He had almost lost his faith, but his friends remained faithful. And you guys helped me to keep my connection with God because you were faithful. So I know that we were there at one point. We got to get back to that point. Our preaching has to be different. Our people have to be thinking in different ways. Our faith has to be more rooted in the things that really matter, which is mercy and justice, like Jesus told them and us. So, yeah, this is a bit away from gentrification in your corporations, but it's, I think, the same reality we are talking about. Yes.
Tonight on CNN, there's a program on Tonight on CNN, there's a Gullah Geechee special, and these are the relatives of the slaves who were given land, who are now losing their land.
Oh.
And so if you're interested, it's tonight. It's either at 9 or 10, but it's the area that is kind of like the Ellis Islands for the Africans to this country. And if you like to travel, it is a wonderful culture.
I appreciate all this talk, and Lucy's bringing up the present way we steal land. But I don't know how we go back 500 years when we stole the land from our indigenous people. Wow, that is our story.
Yes, you're absolutely right. My wife was talking to a group the other day, and she said, what we must avoid when we say, oh, we want to really make good on this thing, we want to change this. And she says, don't go back to chapter 5. Go back to chapter 1. And I think that's absolutely right. Beyond the horrors of slavery is the horror of genocide and stolen land. And I don't see that conversation. I don't see Native Americans being drawn into it. I now see what happens at Standing Rock. And that surely is a beginning. But unless we have that conversation with Native Americans and shut up for a while and just listen to what they have to say, and not talk over them or talk them into what we think they should be saying, what we think is now possible. When you begin with the question, is it even possible, then the conversation is worthless. So how you get there is another thing. But that's where we need to begin, and you're absolutely right. What complicates the land question in South Africa is how far back do we go? Now, with the new politics after 25 years, the question in the Western Cape and in the Northern Cape and places like that is the question of the First Nations. So they are saying we are the descendants, the so-called colored people that you racialized in this way. We are the descendants of the slave society, the people that you brought from other areas in the world mixed with the Europeans, that's us. But we are also the descendants of the First Nations, the Khoi and the San and the Kham. And that is a new conversation. So that question that comes from them is, why do you go back to 1913? Why don't you go back to 1652? That's when we were here. That was when our land was stolen. That's the first resistance against colonization in South Africa. The people you are talking about, the genocide that happened, didn't happen in the 1800s, it happened in the 1600s and the 1700s. So are we going to just forget all about that because it's going too far back? That's the debate. And it complicates the issue enormously, but the issue needs to be complicated. And so in this country, that is a conversation that needs to happen. I have seen, well, when I was with the Desmond Tutu Center in Indianapolis, we hosted a conversation about truth and reconciliation with Native American people, a certain group from Florida. And they had 3 representatives there who spoke that night, deeply moving. But they spoke only of the time when Native American children were taken away from their families to these schools, whatever they called them, and where they were forced to abandon their religion and become Christians. And how you can bring a child to Jesus by stealing the child from her parents is beyond me. I really don't know how you deal with that. There was a wonderful Canadian documentary, a really moving thing, where the United Church of Canada had taken the step to acknowledge their role in what had happened to Native Canadian children in those days. I can't remember the name of but I'm sure if you look it up, you can find it. So it's about the children and the church's role in it and all the horrible things that happened to those children and in these church schools. And I think it's a wonderful beginning, but why begin and stop only there? So now that Canada has talked about the children and the breaking up of the families, the church must now take the conversation further and talk about the land, because that's the issue now. Where does Mr. Trudeau's government give permission to corporations to do fracking on Native Canadian land, to ignore whatever agreements that have been made? I mean, it's the same like here. And it is an ongoing injustice. And I have come to feel that unless we go to those injustices, every other discussion about justice and injustice, however legitimate they may be, loses its power. It's like trying to talk about racial justice in South Africa and not talking about justice for and dignity for LGBTQI people. It loses its legitimacy, it loses its power. And so, yeah, you're right. And I'm asking, where is that conversation most likely to take place? It's not in the media. I mean, all American media belong to 5 corporations, that's it. And you get fed all the same lies all the time. I used to say to my students, as a person coming from outside, I must warn you, don't ever watch American television news. I guarantee you will know less about the world than you did an hour before. And it's actually quite stunning to see what that is. So it won't take place there. It can't take place in the educational system, it seems to be, where they have now textbooks that try to say slavery never happened. the ingenuity of evil at all these levels is mind-blowing. So it can't happen there. It won't happen in corporate boardrooms. God forbid that you take one penny away from their profits. Because if you start there, then we're on the slippery slope and everybody will be talking peace, no wars anymore. And what will happen if that happens? My goodness, can you think? Not making any more money of the blood of innocent children. And the conversation has so been twisted that that becomes the unthinkable. The unthinkable in the conversation is no longer that there are wars and wars and wars that never end, and innocent people are being killed every day. The conversation is not about 1 million people in Yemen or 10,000 starving children because of a naval blockade, a US naval blockade in which they help Saudi Arabia, where they decapitate people every other day. So the unthinkable is no longer that. The unthinkable is, my goodness, that you even demand that we think about these things and do something about it. That's become the unthinkable. And so for the church, it seems to me that we have to stand on the fact that what is unthinkable for the world is not the impossible for God. And maybe that's a good way to end this conversation. You have been so patient on Mother's Day. Give your mothers a hug if they're still around. Think of them if they're not around, love them, even if they drive you crazy sometimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Boesak. We are truly elated to have you here, and your insights, your provocativeness of your opinions and your scholarship is just feeds us. And so we thank you so much for being a part of the Racial Equity Task Force, our Synods Racial Equity Task Force presentations, as we try to widen things, as we try to push through walls and try to do some different things here in this Synod. Our next presentation will be on June 24th. It will be done by the Reverend Krista Fisher, and it will be on the issues surrounding, some issues surrounding incarceration and some of the things that happen within the jail system, the prison system. Krista Fisher is the chaplain at the Dane County Jail, one of the chaplains. Krista Fisher and Catherine, what's your last name? Gore. Are the two chaplains that are there. So, Dr. Boesak mentioned some issues surrounding incarceration. We know that it is a big problem, and we just don't want to leave it where it is. And so we look forward to a presentation from someone who is inside, who can tell us what is going on. That is June 24th at 4 o'clock right here at New Life Church. We want to thank New Life Church, by the way, for the ways that they have been hosting our presentations. Thank you very much. We especially want to thank Pastor Rob, who is going to be leaving us in about a week or so for the sunshine of Florida. Could you mail a little of that back to us when you get there? But we want to thank you for not only your ministry here, but we want to thank you for participating in our ministry. Thank you so much, Rob. I would be remiss if I did not remind us that our brand new bishop-elect is here in the house, the Reverend Vivian Thomas Brightfield. So glad to have you. We thank you for being a part of the Racial Equity Task Force also. And I hope I'm not off base here. We want to thank God for what God did through the election of you as bishop. I am hoping that in some small way, these conversations helped to broaden our perspective, to widen us as a synod, so that, that we could do what was pretty much seen to be impossible. But God specializes in impossible things. And so Bishop-elect Thomas Breitfeld's installation will be August 18th at First in Janesville. At what time?
2 p.m.
At 2 p.m. So you will want to be in the place, because that's going to be quite a celebration. All that having been said, am I forgetting something? I want to acknowledge the other members of the Racial Equity Task Force. Please stand, those of you who are with us, George and Mary and Donna and Krista and Peter, and thank you all, thank you. And Stephen, thank you. Don't forget to sign in as you go out. There are bookmarks that have, racial equity bookmarks that have the schedule of events on them, and some things that would be of information to you. Please share this experience with others so that we can continue to have them, and that they can continue to be effective in terms of our growth and our education. All that having been said, thank you very much for being here. Blessed Mother's Day to those of you to whom it applies. And thank you again for being here at this occasion. Thank you so much.